Let's go straight to my next guest, economics editor at The Spectator, Michael Simmons. Good morning to you.
Morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. Let's talk about, we're talking about joblessness, youth joblessness, but also talking about, why businesses are braced today for these changes. But it's really interesting to hear from my caller. I think you might have just heard him, Liam, talk about how, parents who say you get down the apprenticeship route, you've got to work, you get up and you do the early shifts. I think we've got a lot of young people in particular who don't understand that right now. But businesses are facing it at both ends now, aren't they? What are the changes that have come in today in terms of the law which are impacting businesses and their willingness and ability to hire people?
Sure. So what's happened is basically a shift from sort of the power of the employer more towards the employee. So more rights for the employee in terms of sick pay and maternity pay, but also greater power for unions. Unions can, make requests to access workplaces with barely any notice. They can access digital communications and things. And you might say, well, that's good for the worker. But that would be good for a worker if we were in a super rich, really fast growing country with loads of jobs. But actually, as you know, and all your viewers know, we're in a country where the unemployment rate is sticking up, where jobs are disappearing and we're not growing. And the result is that if you just add more legal risks, more costs for employers, they're not going to take the risk on risky candidates. They're not going to create jobs. And the people that lose out on that are young people, because young people, by definition, do not have, 10 years career reliability where they haven't, relentlessly caused trouble or sued their employer. So many employers who previously would take the risk on school leavers or graduates are just going to say, actually, no, I don't want young people when I can rely on less risky candidates.
Yeah, I mean, it's so obvious. And again, we were talking earlier, this does seem to be a recurring theme with this government, is that the fact that there's no one in this government who's got any experience running a business. They seem to reluctantly, there's this talk about how they say they're not going to roll back on it. They'll probably delay it. It'll be another U-turn on basically having the minimum wage be the same whatever your age. They've already brought it up by a significant amount and added employer national insurance as well from Rachel Reeves' first budget, which has meant huge extra cost to employing your last lowest paid employee, which meant businesses are either laying them off or not employing them in the first place. But they seem to be utterly surprised that if you add all these extra costs to an employer for employing somebody, they might not employ that person because they're not actually bringing that much value to the business. They literally don't make enough money from that extra person to make it worth their while to employ them. This has kind of blown their minds. They're like the worst kind of, Alan Sugar apprentice candidates who can't do basic profit and loss.
Well, this is a bizarre and frustrating theme with this government. I mean, you talk about minimum wage there. We heard that last week, people like Andy Burnham and Ed Miliband trying to suggest that we're somehow a low-pay economy. It's not true. Our minimum wage is the 7th highest in the world when you compare it to sort of average incomes. And the same thing happens with economic policy after economic policy in this government. They announce something that anyone that's read even, a basic introduction to economics knows will backfire on the people it's meant to help.
And everyone tells them at the time, don't do that.
Yeah, everyone tells them and they say, no, you just want Tory austerity or whatever. And then, maybe a few months, a year later, the thing that everyone's warned was going to happen, in this case, increased joblessness that's particularly affecting the youth, happens. And luckily, they do seem to suggest they will U-turn, but it would be better if we didn't get into this problem in the first place.
Yeah, it does seem utterly bizarre. And again, following down the route of sort of European-style workers' rights as well. I was saying earlier on the show, I'm all for trade unions and workers' rights. These are absolutely vital. I don't want people, having to work a 14-hour day down the mines and have no holiday pay. Trade unions brought us that. But we've now got sort of either quite militant, politically activist trade unions like the BMA and the trade drivers unions or frankly some of them are just taking the mick at this point, and it's just not in the interests of their own members because they kind of do them out of a job and certainly prevent the hiring of more people in the expansion of the business, because that's what we've seen on mainland Europe, particularly in France but Germany as well. Very high taxes, very high, huge protection for workers, but it just means that certainly in France at the margins employers just don't want to employ anyone else.
Well, exactly. And these unions and the politicians who speak up for them are kind of operating to kind of a dual delusion. One is they talk of a Britain that, as I say, doesn't exist. We're not a low-paid society. Where people are struggling to make money from work is because they can't get enough hours. It's not because the pay is high enough. And also they pretend that there's all this, abuse of employees happening. This is not a country where people are regularly, thankfully, getting, injured or exploited or dying or anything like that at work. And then the kind of second thing that's at play here is I think the unions act in a sort of cartel way where they want to protect current workers and people who have been paying their union fees for decades, and they don't want to expand those industries. And I think that's not called out enough, that they don't want to create opportunities.
It's a closed shop a lot of the time, isn't it? I mean, in terms of youth joblessness, we've been talking an awful lot about, attitudes, and I've lost track of the number of employers having small businesses, not just people getting in touch on the show or on social media, but people I've met in business. I've gone to a lot of the events, just having a long conversation with people. And I remember so vividly a conversation with a guy who runs like a really well-known construction company. They'd hired me to sort of host an awards event. And he was saying he just tore his hair out. He was working class lad, came from absolutely nothing, did an apprenticeship at this company, had gone on to do really well. He was now the chief executive, multi-million pound business. And he says he's always tried to go back and get, give the same options to, kids. And he says, and over the years, it's just got worse and worse and worse. He goes, we go to like some areas, we put up the notes, we've got recruitment, we're paying them well, we're doing, literally, we either don't get enough people actually even applying, or if they apply, they don't turn up to the interview, or they turn up on the first day and then they don't turn up on the second day. By the end of the first week, we usually don't have anyone left. And he goes, and I know we treat people well. I came through the ranks. I make damn sure I'm offering these opportunities, and they don't want to work. We do have an issue, and it's something that Robert Jenrick is talking about as a reforms, likely chancellor if they win. We need to have a complete basic revolution when it comes to our welfare system and the right of people to choose not to work.
Yeah, I really don't know how we solve this. It's a tricky problem, clearly, for this government and for potentially a future.
Is it tricky?
Well, there's one thing.
You have to be ruthless, but it's not tricky.
No. We have to be ruthless. There is this one issue of changing incentives so to make it impossible that it pays better to be on a life of health-related benefits. But I think there's something that actually the tricky bit has to happen outside of government, and that's our kind of national psyche. I'm sorry to keep going back to this, but something clearly happened during the COVID lockdowns where I think we as a people became a lot more mentally weak. When, small ailments or small mental health issues before, you would have still gone to school, you would have still gone to work, you would have fought through it. And we've changed in our psyche because, or during those lockdowns at least, to say, no, actually, I'm going to not tackle this.
People are told not to go to work now when they're like that. I remember, when I was younger, if I didn't go to work, if I had a little bit of a cold or something, I might give it to other people. I probably caught it at work, but I don't get paid, so I still turn up. But it's very noticeable. This hasn't happened to anything like the same extent in other comparable countries that had similar lockdowns. It just hasn't. We are unique.
Yeah, and I think there's still a question as why we are so different. I think this country, if you compare it to other countries in Europe, we've probably done a lot more in terms of talking about mental health, which I think initially was a well-intentioned thing, but it's gone too far now. And actually, we need to teach our young people, we need to teach ourselves, adults as well, just how to be more resilient. And I think that's the thing that governments are not going to be able to do on their own. That's going to require a sort of concerted national effort from parents, from school teachers, from employers. We all need to club together and just get some sort of British resilience back.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you think that what we've heard from Jenrick this morning, Robert Jenrick, and what we've heard from Nigel Farage in his announcements of some of his front bench yesterday, Robert Jenrick says he's going to restore, he says the benefit system is an economic and moral disaster, and he says that basically they are going to, bring back stability to the British economy. Do you think that Reform have got any policies that could deliver that?
Well, I think this is the Reform actually becoming a bit more economically mainstream. I mean, I've been very critical of some of the things they've said about the Bank of England and wanting to scrap the OBR. And I think what Robert Jenrick suggested today are a lot more closer to centre-right mainstream. So yes, reform the OBR. Yes, make the Bank of England have a kind of wider membership in terms of who makes interest rate decisions. And I think this is a very clever play, really, because it's for them to say to people like the bond markets, to institutional investors, that don't worry, we're a fiscally and economically serious party. You don't have to have a sort of Liz Truss or Andy Burnham style freakout.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much indeed. 11:48.